I'm Barney Glover. I'm the Vice Chancellor and President of Western Sydney University, so it's my pleasure to be here this evening with you and to say a few words and also to introduce our speakers and manage our Q&A session a little bit later in the evening. But I'd like to begin, of course, by acknowledging that tonight's meeting is being held on the country of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to acknowledge their ancestors who have been the traditional owners of this country for thousands of years. And I also wish to pay my respects to the Gadigal people's elders, past and present. And if there are any people here of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent, a particular welcome to you this evening. The culture of the Indigenous people of Australia is the bedrock of Australian culture. As we Australians face China and the rest of the world, we dedicate ourselves to interpreting and preserving our Indigenous culture as our precious heritage. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the forum tonight, a course entitled, as you can see, Face to Face with China, Retrospect and Prospect for Cultural Exchange. Now, my university, Western Sydney University, is by any measure a world-class institution, globally recognised for its research strength and its innovations in teaching, in research, and in community engagement. Our university has formal agreements with more than 30 universities in China and with a number of Chinese government and education authorities. We also have partners, of course, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and, like most Australian universities, right throughout Southeast Asia and beyond. We are a university that very much accepts that its future lies in the Asian region. Being located in the most multicultural region of Australia, Western Sydney University has active and friendly connections with our local Chinese and other ethnic communities. These links contribute greatly to our university's culture and to our teaching and research programs. Many of our research programs relate to issues affecting those communities in our multicultural region. One example that comes to mind, for example, is the Challenging Racism project in the School of Social Sciences and Psychology. As Vice Chancellor, I have the great pleasure of chairing the board of the Australia-China Institute for Arts and Culture. The Institute was established in 2016 with a generous donation from Mr. Zhengmo Wang, chairman of the Yuhu Group. Its aim is to become a hub for cultural exchange between Australia, China, and other centres of Chinese culture, and of course to encourage collaboration in the arts and culture. This forum, of course, tonight is organised by the Institute, and it's an opportunity to inform the public of our plans and activities and to invite suggestions for future developments. Although it opened its doors less than 1 year ago, the Institute has already developed a wide-ranging program of research and public activities. This Saturday, for example, it's hosting an event to mark the Duan Wu Festival, I hope my pronunciation is okay, also known in English as the Dragon Boat Festival. On July the 20th, it's sponsoring a new music symposium and multimedia concert. And it's building on work already underway in other parts of the university, such as a major research program in the Institute for Culture and Society titled Heritage Corridors, which is looking at the transfer of material culture between Guangdong Province and Sydney through migration patterns. Just one example of our inter-university collaboration. This forum tonight is kindly, of course, being hosted by the China Cultural Centre and by its director, Mme Zhao Li. In recent years, Western Sydney University has established excellent and very cordial relations with the centre, and many of our staff have participated in its various activities. And it's of course sad to learn that Mme Zhao is returning to Beijing shortly, but I'm sure we'll keep in touch as she has made many friends in the community here in Sydney. We look forward to working with her successor. Allow me to explain the format of tonight's program just briefly. Shortly I'm going to introduce the members of the panel. Each person will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, after which there'll be time for comments and questions. And please note that the whole program is being recorded and will be available later, we hope, on the Institute's website. At the conclusion of the discussions, light refreshments are kindly being provided by the China Cultural Centre, so I hope you can join us for those refreshments. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce the members of tonight's panel. And I'll introduce them first and then I'll invite them up to speak. So, first of all, Professor Jocelyn Chey, of course, the Director of the Australia-China Institute for Arts and Culture. And of course, Jocelyn has been involved in cultural exchanges with China since the 1970s, when she was the first Australian cultural counsellor in our embassy in Beijing. She was also the first Executive Director of the Australia-China Council, and Jocelyn was made a member of the Order of Australia in January 2009 for her work in promoting Australia-China relations. It's wonderful to acknowledge Jocelyn here tonight, both as the Director of our Institute and as a member of the panel. Dr Geoff Raby is an economist by training, is a former Australian ambassador to China, of course, and has a consulting company based in Beijing. He's been a strong supporter of cultural exchanges with China. In his role as ambassador to China, Geoff founded the Embassy's Writers' Week, and he's taken a particular interest in the arts and is himself considered a considerable collector and patron of the arts. So thank you, Geoff, for being with us. Of course, Mme Zhao Li is the Director of the China Cultural Centre, an organisation dedicated to promoting awareness of and appreciation for Chinese culture and art through cultural events and activities in Australia. She has over 30 years' experience in the cultural sector and worked for the Chinese Embassy in the UK, Romania, and in the Chinese consulate in Sydney, before her appointment to the centre in 2014. And finally, Stephen Gilby is a Senior Program Manager at the City of Sydney, and since 2004 he's worked on the City of Sydney's Chinese New Year Festival, now the largest celebration of the Lunar New Year outside Asia and attracts more than 1.4 million people this year. Please welcome our four panel members, please. So, with no further ado from me, let me ask Jocelyn to come forward as our first speaker this evening. Please welcome Jocelyn.
Good evening, everyone. 晚上好. I'm going to speak in English, though. I've been engaged in cultural exchanges with China for several decades, and quite possibly longer than anyone who's present here tonight. And I do have a big fund of stories that I would love to share with you. But unfortunately, as time is short, all I can do is summarize them, because I think it's more important to look back at the past critically and then propose some guiding principles for the future development of exchanges. And the first and main principle is that nothing is worth doing, nothing, and nothing will be effective unless it comes from the heart. Now, Gough Whitlam, who established diplomatic relations with China 45 years ago, proposed a radical reorientation of our foreign policy, and his vision inspired Australia's artists and writers at that time. And they were quite possibly even more enthusiastic than the rest of the politicians about wanting to know China. And the fervour that they generated spread through the whole public. So the first major Chinese cultural event in Australia was the Archaeological Relics exhibition in 1977. It was shown in Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide, and it was visited by over 1 million people. And remember, at that time our total population was 14 million. Many people queued for hours just to get in. So 40 years ago, China was already clearly, firmly established in our hearts. In the early 1970s, remember that China itself was still emerging from the dark days of the Cultural Revolution. After a decade of isolation, people in China were enthusiastic about contacts with the outside world. Maybe they didn't know much about Australia, and often they confused it with Albania, Albania, but they were certainly interested. Now, the first major Australian cultural event in China was a trade exhibition in 1974. Trade, yes, but they also flew in a whole plane load of sheep. And one of the events at that exhibition was a daily exhibition of sheep shearing. And that attracted 16,000 people to watch every day. And that number was only limited because that's all the number that they let in at the gate. Well, that was a time when we were still getting to know each other. Let's fast forward to where we are now in the 21st century. Everybody knows that since 1980s, China's rapid economic development has been impressive. But much too often, people who talk about how our politics and trade have developed overlook the importance of culture in our bilateral relationship. And let me just explain. When I say culture, what I mean is people's way of life, their mentality, the way they relate to each other, the way they relate to nature. Culture isn't just in books or on paper, and it isn't something which never changes. And in both countries, culture has changed very dramatically in the last 40 years. Now, generally speaking, Australians accept that our future is bound up with China. So cultural exchange, cultural understanding is not an option, but a necessity. There's plenty of evidence how deeply this fact has entered our consciousness. This year, in fact, this month, over 2,000 school children are taking part in the National Chinese Eisteddfod. Chinese traditional festivals are part of our calendar. Our institute, as mentioned, will be celebrating Duanwu, the Dragon Boat Festival, this coming Saturday. Australian translators, publishers, reviewers are helping literature to bridge the language divide. The fourth CALF, C-A-L-F, stands for China Australia Literary Forum, has just concluded in Guangzhou. On this side, that's an activity of the Western Sydney University. Our appetite for cultural understanding has led to If You Are the One, the Chinese dating show on SBS, developing a cult following. As China's economic growth brings more Chinese people to Australia as tourists, as students, as investors, migrants, together with those people who came earlier, second and third generation Australian Chinese, these people are now perhaps the most powerful engine for cultural change, because they provide sensitive insights into the development of a new China-infused cultural ethos. Now we celebrate literary work such as Ouyang Yu's Billy Sing or Isabel Lee's A Chinese Affair. Memoirs such as Helene Chung's Ching Chong China Girl. Australian Chinese artists and performers are now on the stage, and Australian Chinese artists are featured in galleries across Australia. The work of the 4A Centre for Contemporary Chinese Art, the White Rabbit Gallery, CAAP, Contemporary Asian Australian Performance, are particularly noteworthy. The future, therefore, holds great promise. But as I said, nothing is worth doing and nothing will be effective unless it comes from the heart. So what lessons can we learn from the past to guide our further development? I will make 3 points. First, we have to be prepared to take risks I know, having worked in them, that cultural offices worldwide, not just here, prefer safe, tried and true, and often fail to move with the times. High culture, such as classical drama, classical music, appeals to officials, but not necessarily to the wider public. It's hard to find the right formula. Budgets are tight, but we have to consult widely and we have to keep up with trends and with technology. So we should focus on events and movements that have sprouted naturally in the community. And these popular initiatives can be helped along with advice or financial assistance, and they will succeed because they come from the heart. Second, we must accommodate the cultural expectations, the language and history of our audience. Just one story from my time as the Executive Director of the Australia-China Council. In the early 1980s, the Council wanted to expand our activities beyond those that had been proposed or endorsed by Chinese government departments. We wanted to reach out to the public. I turned to a well-known Beijing-based old friend of China, Rui Ali. Maybe you've heard the name. He was always ready to advise on how to develop relations with China. Rui proposed that he would find 3 young farmers from northwest China, and the council could put them on rural properties in Australia where they could learn skills like fencing and working with sheepdogs, neither skill generally known in China, and then after their return home they would pass on these skills to others, and that would bring innovation and creativity to the rural sector. So it all happened. And a year later, when I went to check up on what had actually resulted from this exchange, I found that the 3 young men, while they were in Australia, had all learnt how to drive. And they had applied that skill when they got home to China, because they left the land and became taxi drivers. Not quite what we intended. Well, if our institute had existed then, maybe we might have been able to help, because it's our institute's mission to study and research Chinese culture and hopefully apply what we've learnt, so that knowledge for future exchanges may bring greater benefit to both sides. And next year we're going to be introducing a master's degree in cultural relations, which I hope will work towards this objective. And then thirdly, and lastly, we have to avoid applying political criteria when we're making programming decisions. It is a common but unfortunate fact worldwide that officials sometimes back exchange programs because they appeal to their political leaders rather than target audience. Just one more story, just one. This is from my time when I was cultural counsellor in the Australian Embassy in Beijing in the early days. My first task was to negotiate a program of cultural exchanges. What happened was I gave a list of proposed events to the Cultural Bureau of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There was no Ministry of Culture then. And from that list they selected items that they liked. I was very surprised when they chose the Tasmanian Orosny Children's Choir, although there were many more bigger and better known musical groups mentioned on the list. Now the choir's sample tape had some Australian folk songs and a selection from The Sound of Music. I wasn't very keen on The Sound of Music. I didn't think it represented Australian culture. But the ministry insisted that that program must be the one that they presented. So they visited, they performed in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Amazing. They were given a reception worthy of a head of state. When the plane touched down in each city, there were massed bands on the tarmac, dances and flowers to welcome them. Why? I couldn't understand why they were given so much honour. It was only later, when I read a biography of the person who was the culture czar of China, Xingqiu, written by an American writer, Roxanne Whitker, I learnt that The Sound of Music was Xingqiu's favourite movie. While Western music was banned for ordinary people, she used to watch that movie over and over in her private theatre. And the officials knew that. And so several rows were set apart at every concert, just in case she wanted to attend. In fact, the whole visit had been set up by the bureaucrats, not for the public, but for their political mistress. That wouldn't happen today, I hear you say. Maybe not, but the principle remains, because, as I said at the outset, nothing is worth doing, and nothing will be effective unless it comes from the heart. 40 years ago, it was that feeling which made our early exchanges successful. Now, when Australian and Chinese people meet and mingle in the marketplace, in our schools, our universities, in our homes, in our leisure activities, those cultural exchanges are going to continue to develop from person to person and from heart to heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and I should have, it's fairly clear now what the topic was, but I didn't mention the topic when I introduced Jocelyn, which was how we got to where we are today, 40 years of cultural exchanges, and a lovely presentation to start us off. Our next speaker is Geoff Raby, who'll speak about the contemporary Chinese art scene and how it's been affected by exchanges with Australia. Please welcome Geoff.
Thanks, Barney. It's wonderful sitting here listening to Jocelyn. I could have listened for a lot longer. I'd much rather listen to Jocelyn than be standing up here now. But there's some marvellous stories there, and I can't resist telling another one from the mid-80s about theatre. Although I'm going to talk about visual arts, but we had a great tradition, started with Jocelyn and continued right up until the early 1990s, where the cultural councillors in the embassy were not bureaucrats. They actually came to the embassy either because they knew something about China or something about the culture and the arts, were participants in the culture and the arts, and brought an entirely fresh and interesting perspective. But it goes to some extent what I would like to talk about tonight in the visual arts, but the story is that when I joined the embassy as First Secretary Economic in 1986, and Kevin Rudd was Second Secretary Political in 1986. A story which I can't resist telling you another story, and that is when I was Ambassador, and Kevin came in April 2008 for his first visit as Prime Minister, I actually put on an exhibition of contemporary Chinese art in the embassy to recognise and commemorate his visit. We produced a beautiful catalogue, and they're all of the artists that I'm going to talk about shortly. And Kevin got up with a very, very big crowd of people and reminisced on the days in 1986 when we were in the embassy together, and then paused and hesitated, looked at me and said, but it would seem my career has gone rather better than the ambassadors. The Australians late, but most of the Chinese were frozen. They didn't know what response. That's a good exercise in sort of cultural misunderstanding. Kevin was good at that. There's more of those to relay later. But no, so we had Trillo Gatner, who may be very well known to people here. Certainly if you're in Melbourne, everyone knows Trillo. And he's been very active in the in performing arts and theatre, and has made a huge contribution in Australia. He was a cultural counsellor, and he put on a play called Stretched Imagination by Jack Hibbert. And this was so radical and so extreme. It's amazing he got permission to do it. And it was put on in a theatre in the back streets of Shanghai, and it only lasted about 3 days before it was shut down. but you can imagine how audacious it was to have a one-person play of a drunk in the outback of Australia, swearing constantly as he loses his mind through the sun and alcohol. And it just shows you what you can do, as Jocelyn said, if you take risks. So when Jocelyn was talking about risk-taking, I couldn't help but think of stretch the imagination. It didn't have a long stretch, as the show. But so to my topic tonight, and I didn't quite really know how to approach it. It's a big subject, China's contemporary art and influence in both ways, really, but particularly influence of Australia on it. So I've tried to give it a little bit of structure, and just briefly, I think one needs to think about at least three big phases in the development of contemporary Chinese visual art. I think that's what I'll talk about now. And there's a period which I described, the early phase of innocence and experimentation, that roughly begins in the late 70s and goes through to the tragedy of Tiananmen Square in 1989. And then there's what I call the hot phase. There's a period where not a lot happens, and then from the mid-1990s, suddenly Chinese contemporary art takes off. It becomes a big commercial business, unlike what it was pre-89. And it becomes internationalised, and there is a huge international audience that suddenly becomes very, very interested in it. Major galleries around the world start to take up Chinese contemporary artists. The names you'll know are so famous. If I happened to be in Beijing in that period, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you. I'd be living in the south of France or somewhere, but I wasn't, and so I'm here. So names like Li Xiaodong, Wang Guangyi, the Law Brothers, Yuan Minjun, Zhang Fengzhe, Ai Weiwei, all huge names, hugely collectible and extremely valuable. They all emerge in this period and take off, and the world thinks about Chinese contemporary art differently, and there's a rush to China and to the art. And then that basically goes up until the global financial crisis of 2007-8, and then things change dramatically, and there's an entire reassessment of Chinese contemporary art. The excitement abates, and along with the abating excitement, prices flatline, many fall. There's a whole readjustment of the market. But importantly, I think there's a move to quality. Now, those very hot artists are still important, still commanding great prices, but people are much more circumspect in how they approach Chinese contemporary art, and the bubble's over and it will never come back. That's a time in the past. So that's the sort of context in which the Australian relationship with the Chinese contemporary art scene has ebbed and flowed and changed, and it's been a dynamic process. I had the very good fortune, as I indicated, to be there in the 1980s when the Chinese contemporary art scene was really starting to take off in its innocence phase, its phase of experimentation. And also I was back there to the latter part of the second phase and throughout the period up until now. Throughout this period, there's been a constant flow of artists to and from Australia, engagement of galleries, individual collectors and museums, and it's been a very active period throughout. In the early phase, the Australian Embassy was in many ways the most active participant in this early phase. It's quite interesting that we had a sense of China and its potential under the reforms ahead of most other Western countries. And it very much came, Jocelyn tells the story of Whitlam and his influence, but also Bob Hawke played a very, very important role. He understood when he sat down with Jiang Ziyang and Hu Yaobang, and they laid out their vision of a reformed China, the open door policy, how to rebuild China after the catastrophe of the Cultural Revolution. He bought it, believed it, and realised the implications that would have for Australia if even half the vision were to be realised. No one could imagine what it would be like today, back then. You'd be locked up as barking mad if you said that China would be like it is today and the relationship would be where it is. But certainly people like Hawke had a tremendous vision, and they were also very open and inspired by the cultural dimension of the relationship as well. So the embassy was very engaged with the local emerging art scene. In those days you couldn't have exhibitions of contemporary art. The government had not actually decided how it viewed contemporary art. By and large, the oil on canvas, much of it was imitative of Western modern and contemporary art, and it was easier for the propaganda department to dismiss those sorts of works as being just copying the West. Much more challenging were a small group of Chinese contemporary artists who painted in ink in traditional Chinese techniques, but they painted pure abstract. And of course, pure abstract is pure freedom of thought. And that was incredibly challenging for the authorities, the propaganda, cultural authorities of the day. Our cultural counsellor at that time, going from Krillo Gantner, was Nick Jose, and Nick embraced this emerging art movement with so much enthusiasm, and he turned his apartment over to the emerging artists as a gallery. In those days, we lived in the diplomatic compounds. You had to escort artists one at a time in, past the security, up in the lift, and that's how you have your exhibitions. I used to do the same in my apartment in Xingqiu, Xingqiu, and it was fun. And of course, there's nothing else to do in Beijing. You know, if you didn't go to the friendship store on a Sunday afternoon and look at new bolts of silk that had come in, there wasn't much else to do. But we were really out there in Australia. We really understood this. We embraced it. And as a result of Nick and Krillo's and their engagement with the artistic community, many of these artists started to come to Australia. And some of them would be very well known to today, such as Guan Wei. Guan Wei, Lin Chunyan, another one. They went to Hobart and studied art. Australia started to become the go-to place for Chinese contemporary artists. It was a buzz about going to Australia, and many other artists started to come to Australia. Australia also influenced these artists. So, for example, I'll use Guan Wei as an example. Once he was in Australia, he became interested in Australian colonial history and in maps and in oceanography and navigating by the stars. But most importantly of all, the interaction between different cultures, people meeting together on the shores of Australia, and that still informs his art today. Lin Chunyan became a naturalist painter from the very dark, unhappy, brooding images that he was painting in Beijing. Eventually he moved to very light and colourful natural paintings in Australia. So the influences in many directions. And there are others. Hu Ming, for example, ACIAC, Xiaoxian, they would all be fairly well known to you, I'm sure. And we had a very big influence in the development of their profession, their skills. So along comes Tiananmen Square, and many of those who were in Australia at that time were allowed to stay in Australia, or if they chose to, all were. Bob Hawke did one of the most courageous acts I think, of any Prime Minister. He said after June 4th that any Chinese in Australia with a visa could become a permanent resident with a view to settling here permanently. And he was opposed completely by his cabinet. And when I was ambassador, because I had in my residence, those of you who've been there, all, or not all, but much of the work of some of these artists all around the walls. And Bob came in one day to see me about business, and you know, Hawke style, he's sitting there fidgeting, having a cup of tea and pulling in his ear and playing with his cups. He looks around and says, he's looking at the paintings. I said, are you interested in the paintings? He said, yeah, mate, yeah, mate, yeah. I said, Bob, you're responsible for them. What do you mean, mate? What are you talking about? Why am I responsible? I said, Bob, these are artists that stayed in Australia when you gave them permanent residency after Liu Se. And he became extremely emotional and overwhelmed. And he then told me the story that he alone in cabinet pushed this, and everyone opposed him. And so I took him on a tour, and he just couldn't believe that that decision then had morphed into this relationship between the arts between Australia and China. So moving forward to the hot phase, and the artists that were stationed, that were set up in Australia and built their careers. Not surprisingly, I should say that the galleries played a very important role in this period. Ray Hughes introduced to Australia some of the greatest names in Chinese contemporary art from that period. Liu Xiaodong, Qi Jilong, the Law brothers were all part of Ray's stable at that time. And then, of course, as Jocelyn mentioned, in the early 2000s, Judith Nielsen starts collecting and produces ultimately the White Rabbit, which is one of the greatest museums of Chinese contemporary art in the world. And we should be enormously grateful and proud of that. And of course, the big gallery, the big museums, both in Sydney and Melbourne. And I also think it's important we don't forget Redgate. Most of you would know Redgate. It was the first contemporary art gallery in China. It put Chinese, it gave legitimacy and seriousness to Chinese collecting Chinese contemporary art. And it was set up by Brian Wallace, an Australian. It's still there today. Some of the artists who've been through Redgate are now some of the biggest names in the Chinese contemporary art world, and he has supported that. And finally, the Australia-China Council has been extremely important in that process as well, and also has supported residencies with Redgate for many, many years. Then just to wind the clock forward a bit more, we're in the mature phase now, as I describe it. It's a much calmer scene. There's a great deal of emphasis on quality. But many of those artists who returned from Australia to China, and who are still there, of course, names like Wang Zhiyuan, Xiao Lu, the Gun, Shen Xiaomin, globally collectible artists, but still maintain a very strong connection with Australia, the Australia that actually gave them that moment and that space in their careers to build and develop before they went back to China. But the ebb and flow is now much more in both directions. There's a lot more interaction in both ways. And I see Kate Kroll sitting here, and she was very instrumental in organising during the Year of Australian Culture in 2010 a wonderful exercise where we took half a dozen, I guess, Australian artists and took them around China on a second-class ticket on the train, which we called Hard Sleeper, with John McDonnell from... Yeah, well, that's right, we had a small budget. That's the other thing. The Australian governments always talk a big game, but they have very shallow pockets. So for the Year of Australian Culture in China in 2010, we're given $1 million extra. And we have the Sydney Symphony Orchestra over, the Australian Ballet, and you compare that to what the French, the Italians, the Germans, just about anyone else would do. And so Kate and I and a few others, we had a little team, and we decided that we would just do small things, small collaborative things. And Hard Sleeper came out of that. And it was a group of amazing Australian artists who were changed and influenced by that experience as well. So, as I said, the ebb and flow is very much now in both directions. It's mature, it's as it should be. Redgate still powers on. Ray Hughes' gallery's gone, Sherman's gone, but 4A now is playing very important roles, important galleries in every city of Australia. And of course, the Queensland Gallery of Modern Art is one of the great collections of Chinese contemporary art in the world. And the Museum of Old and New Art in Hobart has a very strong Chinese contemporary art presence. So it's very mature now, it's very well established, and it's reached, I think, a very important level. We are not as significant as we once were. It stands to reason. Once everyone else rushes to China, once it becomes as big as what it has. But there was a time when we were disproportionately important. The relationship with Australia in the visual arts is still important, and it's important for us as much as it is for the Chinese artists who are engaged in it, because as Jocelyn said, culture is extremely important in any sort of relationship between countries, between peoples, and we have to always in Australia broaden our vision and approach to China beyond the transactional to understanding China in its entirety, and to build the people-to-people relationships that depends so much on the role of culture in forging those bonds. So there's a great, I think, story around the contemporary art scene, and it will continue to be extremely important in the relationship into the future. Thank you very much.
Clearly we should have set aside several hours actually for the nice forum, because I think all of our speakers have much to say, and that was fabulous. Geoff, and we appreciate it, that snapshot of such an exciting series of periods in the relationship around contemporary Chinese art in Australia. Now, our third speaker this evening is Mme Zhao Li, and her presentation will be around how cultural exchanges make us different. Madam Li, please welcome.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. When Jocelyn first approached me to co-host this forum, she asked me to talk about the cultural exchange, the prospect of cultural exchange between China and Australia. But I think it's interesting for me to talk something about my experience, because I have stayed here for about 10 years. So I suggested my topic, cultural exchange makes us different. When people, today I want to talk with you, to share with you, by answering the following questions. 3 questions. What is cultural exchange? Why is it important to us and our society? How does cultural exchange make us different individually and socially? The first question, question 1. What is cultural exchange? When people talk about cultural exchange, usually they think about exhibitions, performances, which are apparently related to arts. So I tried to find some definition online, and this is the definition which I think is more precise. Cultural exchange is a broad definition given to any mutual sharing of information, usually cultural, between 2 or more species for the purpose of improving friendship and understanding between each other. So, cultural exchange could be exchange in sport, in education, medicine, tourism, and many other fields. So my second question is, why is cultural exchange important to us and our society? As everyone knows, we are now living in the era of information explosion and globalization. Countries, peoples, and communities are becoming more and more intertwined, and interdependent. We can no longer cut ourselves off. This phenomenon is more evident around us in Sydney. Every day, you may come into contact with people of different backgrounds, different cultures, different ways of thinking, different ways of expression, different habits of appreciation could lead to misunderstanding, conflicts, prejudice, and even hate. So cultural exchange is an effective way to enhance mutual understanding, mutual respect, mutual appreciation. Understanding each other's cultures can narrow the gap of differences, make us different individually and socially, and create a brighter and enriched world. So my second question is, how does cultural exchange make us different individually and socially? I will take more time to talk about this topic because I will give you some examples. First, cultural exchange provides fresh insights that broaden our horizon. I still remember in 2014, we co-hosted a reception for the principals of New South Wales public schools who offer Chinese lessons, Chinese classes. Professor Carrie Brown, former director of China Study Center, said in his speech at this occasion, "If you know Chinese, you will know China. If you know China, you will know the other half part of the world." By knowing Chinese has broadened his horizons and changed his life. So maybe he exaggerated a little bit, but he tells you the importance of exchanges with other people and awareness of the other cultures. This is Carrie Brown. And also, in 2015, on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of victory of the World War II, with joint forces of Shanghai Jewish Museum and Sydney Jewish Museum, we hosted a documentary exhibition entitled Jewish Refugees and Shanghai, which depicted the refugee life of nearly 20,000 Jewish people in Shanghai during World War II. At the opening ceremony, it gathered together 6 former Jewish Shanghailanders from Australia, who are now at their 80s and 90s, and their families. On behalf of the former Shanghailanders and the descendants of Jewish refugees, Mr. Fred Ottman and Mrs. Martin Bridger both shared real experiences and touching stories of their families, through which people could achieve a vivid picture of what happened during the wartime. Many attendees left their comments after visiting the exhibition. They said they have never heard about this history. This history is important not only to Chinese, Jewish people, but also to the world. We should treasure our peace and equality in the mankind. In 2016, we signed an MOU of long-term cooperation with Sydney College of Arts, which includes a residency program. 2 students from SCA were selected to stay 2 weeks in Zhejiang province. The following are the reports written by them after they returned back from China. I abstracted some of what they said in their report. The first one, written by Rebecca. My recent cultural exchange to Hangzhou and Zhejiang province was endlessly inspiring, full of insight and intrigue. Over the 2-week trip, we were given the opportunity to visit an array of museums and galleries, studios and cultural centers that has given me a unique view on the diverse cultural landscape of the art scene of Hangzhou and Zhejiang. Needless to say, I had a wonderful time in China visiting Hangzhou and Zhejiang province. I have returned home incredibly inspired by the landscape, architecture, and natural surroundings of Zhejiang, as well as inspired by the dedication of artistry and skills of all we saw and those we met whilst on exchange. So, and the second student, another student called Louis. It was eye-opening to see how much architecture is appreciated and distinguished as not only a mode of cultural and historical necessity, but also as a form of artistic expression. While in Hangzhou, we were able to visit many art galleries and museums, which really altered my perception on how art, history, and culture is understood and appreciated in different cultures. One of my favorite highlights of my time in China was visiting the Folk Art Center. It was really refreshing to see how farmers and fishermen are given access to art and treated with such respect in art field. So there are many other examples which show that if you know more about the other peoples and the other cultures, it could raise your interest in international issues, change your way of thinking, and give you a better understanding of what is happening around you. So second, cultural exchange enriches our own lives by inspiring new forms of artistic expression and different ways of lifestyle. For example, Chinese New Year Festival in Australia becomes more and more popular. Stephen will tell you how it's popular. Lots of local people join us to celebrate the festival. They enjoy themselves by watching performances, experiencing Chinese traditional handcrafts, wearing Chinese traditional costumes, eating Chinese food, vice versa. Christmas is celebrated as the same in China. Sometimes people of old generation complain that young generation and the retailers have more passion on Christmas than Chinese New Year. These are some experience Chinese New Year in the center from the public school. This is a celebration in the city. This is Christmas in China. Yeah. So, Chinese garden in Barney Harbor is another good example of cultural exchange. It was donated by Municipal Guangzhou to Sydney 39 years ago. Now it becomes a very pleasant place for Sydneysiders to have tea with friends, to take photos with Oriental architecture. It makes this unique experience more easy for the local people. I even saw some young people having their wedding in the garden. All those have made our life more interesting and colorful. Third, cultural exchange enables us to make international and cross-cultural friendship and create opportunity of cooperation. Cultural exchange is a people-to-people exchange. People become lifelong friends during their exchanges. Maybe someone knows Dr. Catherine Ingram from Sydney Conservatory of Music. She is an ethnomusicologist. She spent many years studying the music of China's minority groups. She is the first non-Chinese to complete substantial research into Kang in Chinese Dong. During those years, she lived with the Dong people in a remote county as their family member. She and the Dong sisters have become very close friends. After she came back from China, she continues his research on comparing the musical activities of cultural minorities in Australia and China. Last month, she invited her 6 Dong sisters from China to stay at her home in Sydney and to present a rare concert together with Australian Indigenous people. I believe this kind of friendship has changed her life and her future. I also like to mention the China-Australia Millennium Project. It was a program connecting dynamic, creative young leaders from China and Australia. Members are divided into different think tanks. They discuss topics of common interest and try to find solutions to the problems in the related fields. In 2015, our center sponsored the Art and Culture Tank. 10 young leaders from both countries stayed together 5 days, sharing their ideas and talents, and become very close friends. I was told recently that they still keep in touch and are doing some other projects now. So I would like to take myself as an example. I worked consecutively 10 years in Australia. My job is to encourage cultural exchange between China and Australia. Through my work, I got to know many people here, and many have become my friends, like Jocelyn, like Stephen, like Robert Paul, Helen. We share our ideas, we care about each other's concern, and we made many dreams into reality. Yesterday, I received a thank you letter from Nicholas Jones. I'm happy to share with you. Many of you maybe you know about Nicholas. He is professor of English literature in Adelaide University, and his wife Claire Roberts is the professor in Melbourne University. I quote from his letter. You have been excellent in your role and have set a fine example of what is possible between China and Australia culturally. All of us associated with Western Sydney University owe you a special thanks for making the initial approach that had led to ongoing literary exchange through the partnership with China Writers Association. China-Australia Literature Forum, the 4th edition, happened successfully earlier this month, as Jocelyn mentioned, in Guangzhou. From this event, many visits, translations, publications, and other continuous exchanges have resulted, involving some of the biggest names in Chinese and Australian writing. Fourth, cultural exchange helps us to gain cross-cultural skills in globalized world. In recent years, while the development of China and Australia relationship, people with bilingual who are familiar with both Western and Eastern cultures are very popular by headhunters because they can easily adapt to their workplaces and can make their business more effective. I believe many of you present here have this kind of experience. So I don't want to discuss it anymore. All these examples happened in the past, but still have impact on us. I hope what I talk will encourage more people to be involved in cultural exchange. I would like to conclude my talk with a video clip. Our center organizes several workshops every year in the Sydney public schools. Many students came into contact with Chinese arts for the first time. They are so attracted by different culture. This video clip I got from our media. No sound? I'm sorry if there's no sound because she said the first time is different with the other culture, and the first time for me to touch the Chinese culture, and I will choose Chinese as my selected lessons. So this is very interesting. So I don't know whether she is studying Chinese now. If so, I wish her success and a good future. Thank you very much.
Madam Lee, thank you so much for that. And on behalf of Western Sydney University, I also thank you for your great contribution to CARF, as we describe it. And I know that my previous university was Charles Darwin University. We had a lovely Chinese garden there as well, which is always a very important place on the campus. Our last speaker this evening is Stephen Gilby, and Stephen will be talking to us about the city of Sydney and its role in Chinese arts and culture. So please, welcome, Stephen.
Thank you all very much for coming tonight. As was mentioned, I'm going to speak about Chinese New Year in particular, and the role that Chinese New Year has been able to play over the years with cultural exchange between China and Australia. Chinese New Year reached its 21st year this year. Obviously, celebrations of Chinese New Year predate the city's festival by a very long way, but the city has been involved for the past 21 years. What the festival's been able to do is really offer an opportunity for cultural exchange between the local Chinese community and the broader population, between China and Australia, between the different communities that celebrate the Lunar New Year, but also as a way of showcasing Sydney and Australia's cultural diversity to visitors and people from other parts of the country. The scale and the location and the profile of the festival is what really provides a huge stage for that activity. It's at once very personal, one-on-one, but it's extremely public and broad. So this is a photo of the festival back in 2007 at the Belmore Park Markets. And just to go through a little bit of the history of the festival, in 1996 the festival began with a market in Dixon Street Mall that attracted about 50,000 people. In 2017 the festival attracted nearly 1.4 million people. Almost a million of those, 950,000 odd, came to the Lunar Lanterns exhibition alone. So in that time it's become the largest celebration of the Lunar New Year outside Asia. And I guess the question is, why has it grown so much? Why has that happened? The Chinese New Year Festival is at its very heart an exercise in cultural exchange. It's an exercise in exposing Chinese culture on a very large stage and having it there for more people to learn about and to experience. It provides an avenue for experience and not a lecture. So I think that's really important. It's an entertaining way for people to experience. It's a hugely public entry point, And then there's opportunities within the program, within the festival, for people to delve deeper. So it might be a Chinese Youth League Cantonese opera workshop. It might be activities at the Chinese Garden of Friendship. It could be some of the performance program involving more than 500 community performers, or art exhibitions, or film screenings, or more things like that. In terms of what's made those things successful though, I think there's two main elements, and those are authenticity and accessibility. Now, in terms of authenticity, obviously, the events that take part as part of the festival have to be culturally authentic. This is a photo from 2005 of one of the temple tours at Yuming Temple. And I guess if you really want a broader audience, it's as Jocelyn was saying, it has to have heart. If you want a broader audience to come and experience and take part in the festival, it has to be something that's real. It can't be a Disneyfied version of culture, it has to be true. The content in the festival is largely generated by the community. So the city basically puts it together, but it's from the community. In 2017, there were 35 different community groups taking part as part of a community performance program, and 84 associated events that are produced by different parts of the community and institutions in Sydney, along with 12 large-scale lanterns designed by Chinese Australian artists, and I'll come to those later. The city works very closely as well with advisory panels. Councillor Koch, before he was a councillor, was a member of one of our advisory panels and still continues in that role, along with advice from stakeholders like the Ministry of Culture. Zhao Li individually and quite personally has been a huge factor in the growth of the festival over the years, particularly in the involvement of delegations from China, in her role both at the consulate and now at the China Cultural Centre. So I think the festival, along with many other people, as we've heard tonight, owes Zhao Li a huge debt from the work she's done while she's been here. The event really, as I said, is a stage. And what it's doing is providing an opportunity for the community to really shine and to be exposed to a larger audience, along with advice and things that can really help them shine in the best possible way. The authenticity, though, is not just about Chinese culture. It also needs to be authentic to Sydney. This is a photo of the Ox Lantern that was designed by Tianli Zhu, who's here tonight. Thank you, Tianli. And Tianli's roosters are actually on the flyer as well that she designed for this year's festival. When I say it needs to be authentic to Sydney, I think what we've really been trying to do is, with the Sydney Chinese New Year Festival, it's not pretending to be an event in China. It's not pretending to be a celebration of Chinese New Year in China. What it has to be is something that could only be a celebration of the Lunar New Year in Sydney. The lunar lanterns that we have a photo of here are a really good example of that. To begin with, they're not lanterns in the traditional sense of lantern festivals that you would see during Chinese New Year in China. It's 12 lanterns in the form of the lunar zodiac animals, up to 10 metres high. But each one of these is designed as an artwork by a contemporary Chinese Australian artist. They're able to take advantage of the beautiful weather we have in Sydney at Chinese New Year time as well. It's not the depths of cold winter as it would be in Beijing. And it's set around the iconic backdrop of Sydney Harbour. So it really does help that we have all of these things coming together that allow it to create a really iconic celebration that could only be here in Sydney. And I think that's what's really important about the authenticity of it. It has to go both ways. In terms of accessibility, one thing that Chinese New Year has been able to do very well is create a festival that everybody feels that they can participate in, everybody from every background in Sydney. One interesting piece of data that came out of research from this year's festival, out of the attendees, 78% of people do not celebrate Chinese New Year at home. So 78% of the audience, which is an amazing figure. And I think, until the festival went through its big period of growth in the last couple of years, that figure sat at about 50%. So in that period, with basically the doubling of the size of the festival, it's the broader community that have come out and really embraced this. And I think that really shows the fact that this has become an event, a celebration, that is something that everybody in Sydney, no matter what their background, can take part in. So further to the accessibility, I think it also gives international groups a chance to perform, which gives locals access to cultural traditions that wouldn't commonly be available here in Sydney. This photo is a picture of performers from Guangzhou who performed at the festival launch in 2016. It also gives those international performers coming to Sydney an opportunity to experience a uniquely Sydney Chinese New Year. It's really given the scale, it's giving a really good platform to showcase different community and international groups and give the locals and international groups alike access to a much larger audience than they might otherwise have. Now, as I mentioned, since 2006, we've also been hosting international delegations as part of the Chinese New Year Festival. This is a photo of one of the floats from our first delegation from Beijing. But we've also had delegations from Guangdong and Guangzhou, Shanxi, Henan, Chongqing, Hubei, Chengdu, and Shenzhen. Delegations have been starting from up to 500 people with Beijing. They've gone up to 1,000 people with Guangdong. And just talking a little bit about the involvement of the group from Beijing, in that first year it helped to grow the audience for the parade by 30,000 people. It really helped to inspire city and local groups with the sort of floats and performances that they were producing, things that had never been seen in the parade locally before. And it really helped grow the festival, as I mentioned, in terms of that audience at the parade, but also in the sort of coverage and the international profile that that gave to the festival. And that just creates a bigger venue and a bigger platform for that exchange of cultures. In 2009, the parade went to a night event, and that again increased the audience. So that change helped the audience grow to 130,000 people. Over the years, the various delegations, and the photo here is groups from Henan in 2009, they really have helped to inspire the city and local groups with different ways of performing and different ways of doing things and different cultural expression, and exposing the audience here in Sydney to different parts of China and different traditions that exist there. The delegations have also really helped the festival become more contemporary, and I think that's a really important fact. This is a photo from the Angels Band from Guangdong that performed in 2007. And it was the first time we had a really contemporary performance group participate in the festival. And I think activities like this have really inspired other groups within the community, but also the city, to look at different ways to not just look at the traditional culture, but strive to represent contemporary culture. And I think that's part of what Jocelyn was talking about earlier. You really need to be brave in many ways to have not just the traditional side of things, but something that's really going to speak to a local audience. That sort of delegation engagement hasn't just come through the public-facing parts of the festival as well. This is a photo of Shanxi in 2008, and I guess as an example of the sort of work that happened with Shanxi behind the scenes that helped that sense of understanding between the two groups. Shanxi officials came to Sydney twice before actually coming to Sydney to learn more about what needed to happen here, how to present themselves, and how to get the most benefit of how they presented themselves here in Sydney. It built a really strong relationship between Sydney and local Shanxi performers, and city staff were able, including myself, were able to go to Shanxi as well in 2007 prior to them coming out. Part of this as well, the City of Sydney hosted a lunch for all of the Shanxi performers while they were here. There was 580 or so people. But it gave a real opportunity for the performers from Shanxi to meet people locally. And I think it's important to note, while the festival's really public and broad in its scale, that personal and face-to-face and one-on-one experience is also incredibly important. So just running through some of the other activities that the delegations have managed to achieve over the past years. We've done a lot of theatrical performances as well in places like Town Hall, Angel Place. This is a performance by the Chengdu delegation in 2012. And it gives an opportunity for people to see the sorts of performances that they may not otherwise be able to see here in Sydney on a regular basis. As I mentioned though, that face-to-face element is really important. This is from this year, 2017, and it's a craft workshop that was held by artisans from Sichuan province at Customs House Square. Those sort of participatory activities, I think, are incredibly important. It really it allows people to have an engaging experience of culture, from printmaking like this through to dance workshops. And those one-on-one, face-to-face experiences give the delegation members and the local audience members a personal experience to actually meet and get to know an actual person. In 2015, the festival began to change quite a bit, and we started that with the Lanterns of the Terracotta Warriors, which was an exhibition that had been created by a team led by Chinese artist Xia Nan for the Beijing Olympics. So with 90,000 warriors standing 2.1 metres tall at Hickson Road Reserve underneath the bridge, it really put the city on the harbour and Chinese New Year in a really iconic Sydney location. 80,000 people came to that event, and you compare that to, say, 130,000 at the peak of the parade. So a really amazing turnout for a single exhibition. I think the location as well really helped to show the increasing stature and profile of the festival. Very important and still very connected with Chinatown, but also putting Chinese New Year in Sydney on a global scale and a global footing. And this is actually built on a series of exhibitions that we had run leading up to this. Firstly, an exhibition during Chinese New Year that was done by Redgate Gallery, and then Cade also managed to curated a couple of exhibitions for us featuring Asian Australian artists, contemporary artists. And that contemporary expression of art, I think, is very important to helping to identify something really unique and different and very Sydney about celebrations here for Chinese New Year. So our largest change for the Chinese New Year Festival came in 2016. So this was when we introduced the Lunar Lantern exhibition. And as I said, this grew from, we had 680,000 people at the festival in 2015. With the introduction of lunar lanterns, this grew to 1.3 million people. So the lunar lanterns really did aim to further establish the festival as a uniquely Sydney celebration of Lunar New Year, and it's largely because it is so different to any celebration that you would see in any other part of the world. It became much more accessible as well. For the audience, it gave them 10 days to experience this exhibition over the duration of the festival, rather than having to be at one point at one time for a parade or other event. It gave more opportunities to artists to do the sort of work that they would probably never otherwise have the opportunity to do. So people like Zhao Li, Claudia's work here, the monkeys that were designed by Lawrence Tan, they're all contemporary artists, Chinese Australian artists, but they're built on a scale that would be very difficult to achieve if the artist was trying to do that by themselves. So, I mean, Zhao Li's ox is probably still about the biggest, bulkiest one that we've ever done, at about 10 metres high. So it's, you know, it's a really rare opportunity to be able to do something, and to do something that is, it's an ox, but it's something very different, and it really is a contemporary expression of that, and something that's very Sydney. So that first year of Lunar Lanterns attracted 753,000 people, which is about a six-fold increase on the audience that we would receive for the parade. In 2017, that grew even more, so we moved the focus of the Lunar Lanterns exhibition from being all across the CBD to focusing on Circular Quay area. And that was based upon feedback from the audience that was quite unmanageable. So it created an experience of lunar lanterns at Circular Quay, and then other experiences in Chinatown, in Pitt Street Mall, in Martin Place, different things for people to do on different nights. And this year we grew to having 957,000 people at the Lunar Lanterns exhibition, which is a huge growth in just a couple of years. One of the things, though, that's really important, we've spoken about some of the big things, but I think the community group participation is something that's really, really important. When we last did the parade, we had 23 community groups involved and 75 associated events in the festival. In 2016, that grew to 38 different community groups taking part in the community performance program, producing 22 hours of programmed entertainment, with 181 separate performances with performers aged 3 to 90. In 2017, this year, that grew even more to 27 hours, up from 22, and 235 separate performances, up from 181. And what it's giving is local community groups a really fantastic opportunity to showcase themselves to some of those 1.4 million people who are coming to the parade, to the Lunar Lanterns, but not just for a second or for a moment. They're there, people can stay and watch them. They also don't have to provide a truck or a float or a sound system. They can come and do what they do really well, and they can shine, and it gives them a really good opportunity to do so. Another element that's come into the parade, into the Chinese New Year Festival, is our volunteer ambassador program. So these people are aged between 18 and 70 years. It's people from all different communities, which I think is really interesting. 99 people this year who took part in this. And when we spoke to them, they were really looking at opportunities to give back to the community. For some of them, it was an opportunity to learn about their own culture, and for others, it was an opportunity to learn more about Chinese and other cultures. But these were the people who were out every day at the lanterns, and they were the face of the festival to the public, and they were the ones giving them the information. So just in summary, over 21 years, the Chinese New Year Festival has helped take celebrations of Lunar New Year into the mainstream. In Sydney now, Chinese New Year is something that is celebrated by people of all backgrounds, and I think that's a really exciting change. We're also proactively trying to share what Sydney does and what Sydney is, a unique, multicultural and diverse city, and we're sharing that with the rest of the world. Thank you.
There was a lot of passion in that, Steve, and there were some fabulous examples of just how the festival has grown and how important it is to Sydney. We've had a wonderful journey, 40 years of reflection, the Chinese-Australia contemporary connection over the same period, what cultural exchange really means, and largely how it manifests itself in a wonderful example with Chinese New Year here in Sydney. I think we have run over time, but we're going to shorten our Q&A a little bit. So we'll ask the four speakers to come on stage. And while they do, I'm going to ask Professor Yi-Chen Lan, who is our Pro-Vice Chancellor Global Development at the University, to facilitate the Q&A session, which means that you can ask your questions in Chinese if you like, because Yi-Chen can also translate them. So it'll add to the cultural experience. And I'll hand over to Yi-Chen.
Thanks, Vice Chancellor. So we have Q&A sessions from now. We've got 4 members on the panel. Anyone like to please that with the grey jacket? We've got microphone. We've got floating microphone somewhere, right? Okay. Oh, this one. Can we pass them to the lady in the grey jacket?
Thank you, all the speakers. I work in university, and by working with international students from China, I know a higher education experience is life-changing experience for them. It is a one kind of cultural exchange as well. So by picking up the point one of the speakers has made about cultural exchange, it will make a difference to the two parties or all the parties involved. And also the point that last speaker made about authenticity. The wonderful work Ms. Zhu Li has done it's authentic to Sydney and to China, so it's becomes a unique work of its own. So my question is, I want to have your insights on, if all of you or some of you want to share your insights on this question. What do you see the Australian culture or Australian value would be shaped to be during and after the China and Australia integration?
Anyone wants to speak on? Yes, Jocelyn.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you for that question. It's probably, like, what is the secret of the universe? But I'll just focus on you talking about your work with international students, because that's something that I think we haven't really covered in our discussion tonight. And I think as Australia is one of the preferred destinations for students in China, it's something that we need to think about very seriously. That is, how to improve the experience of Chinese students and other international students while they're here. And that's something that's been on my mind personally for a very long time. And I'm a bit concerned that sometimes we don't do it very well. In particular, I have had both Australians and Chinese complain to me, saying that the students are not who are coming here do not really get an authentic experience of Australia, because they tend to share rooms, all living, 6 of them all together. They find work in a Chinese restaurant. They talk to each other in Chinese all the time. And last year I had a group of students, mostly from China, who I invited to lunch at my home, and they said it was the first time that they had been to visit any Australian's home. And I think that's a shame, and we have to do something about it. And I've mentioned this to my colleagues at Western Sydney University, and I've mentioned it to people at University of Sydney, where I'm also a visiting professor. And I hope that both those universities are going to take my comments seriously.
Would you like to say something?
Yeah, please. You're the university.
So just before we take the next question, just following up on the question about our international students. Well, I believe the students, every university is trying to bring domestic Australian students and international students together, not just for learning, studying, but also social, cultural engagement. And we do whatever we can to bring them together. And interesting enough, when you talk about what is the real Australian culture, perhaps for Western Sydney University, we have 60% of students actually coming from non-English speaking background as Australian students. So in a classroom, just like this, we don't know who is international students, who is domestic students. So that also creates another layer of atmosphere in terms of learning, engaging. When you open your mouth speaking about contributing to the classroom exercises, now you understand, well, you are coming from China, from Guangzhou. I'm actually from Wagga Wagga. All right. So that's but we all look alike. So that's yeah. So that's really a new sort of a sort of different level of cultural exchange and different level of multicultural environment. So that's yes. So or we take the next question probably. Yes, please. Yep, you've got a microphone.
Andrew, thank you everyone. It's firstly incredible to have so many, like to recognise the depth of your experience of all of you on the stage there. You're incredible. And the commitment is also really wonderful. I have a question, which is a lot of what we've talked about today is about cultural exchange that really is a lot about China's very impressive culture, contemporary or traditional, and the influence that it has on us. And I wanted to know what your thoughts are on an appetite in China for Australian cultural perspectives. And I am thinking mostly around visual arts, performing arts. What's the appetite there at the moment?
Look, it's good. It's a very good question. I think there's very big appetite. We run very, Australian government runs very active cultural programs. All of the big groups in Australia have China now on their list. I just was meeting with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra last week in Beijing, and they now have an annual visit scheduled, annual visit to China in their scheduled program, and their relationships are very broad with visual arts. It's the same. So look, I think it's great appetite, and I think also Indigenous Aboriginal art is now being appreciated and understood in China. So it's really a two-way exchange, very much.
Thank you all. That's been very interesting for me. One of the things, as a segue into the first question more, is I'm really interested in this notion of person-to-person relationships, because I think that without developing or establishing grounds and opportunities for person-to-person relationships, then all the big shows and the big splashes that we do are, flashes in the dark, if you like. And if you have comments on that and how you've been working in that area, I'd really appreciate hearing them. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd agree. That sort of thing is incredibly important. It can't just be about the big splash, as you put it. I guess one of the ways that we see that happening with the Chinese New Year Festival, just as an example, is just looking at our audience. Our audience is incredibly diverse, and our audience are there all experiencing this celebration together. And I think, we're not really involved in the business of individual one-on-one setting up relationships with people. What we're doing, as we do with everything with the festival, I think, is we create a stage of opportunity for people to do that, and for people to take that on in a more natural way, rather than trying to create a framework around which we want them to do that. So it may not be exactly answering the question, but I think we do see that happening organically through the festival, and just the smiling faces of people out there. You look at the photos of the audience that I was showing before, and it's incredibly diverse.
Yeah.
Very quick, mine is only a very short question. I want to thank all the very, very exciting and fascinating presentations. My question, perhaps it can apply to all four of you, because I'm talking about government policy actually. I'm really interested in having talked to Royal Bank, and at that time you're telling us there's a modern change of the modern arts. Do they have those visions then? The policy would influence all the funding and all the directions. So anybody can answer, because all of you are affected by funding and policies.
Can I just go first, because I think I've been go first, Hal. So you may have misunderstood me. What I was saying is when Bob Hawke went to Beijing in 1986, and it was an extraordinary visit. He spent 10 days in country, and for the whole time he was accompanied either by the Party General Secretary Hu or by the Premier Jocelyn. And they talked about their vision of China. Open door policy, reform, how China would integrate in the international economy, and that's really what Hawke took away. But he also understood that the society would change as well. You don't open up to foreign investment and trade, you don't integrate the international economy, and everything else stays the same. And don't forget, in those days, everyone was still running around in mouse suits, and media and entertainment was even more controlled today. There was only state television, nothing else. So it was a vision of how a huge social change would come in the wake of economic changes.
I think there was a long-term vision that was developing in China, and one story that I can put forward to illustrate that point is from the time when I was with the Australia-China Council, and one of the projects that we accepted and assisted was from the state-owned People's Daily, right? So which is sometimes called the mouthpiece of the party, although one interpreter by mistake called it the mouth organ of the party. Anyway, they approached us and they said, we think as China is opening up, we need to have an English language publication, but we have no experience in running an English language publication. So could we help them? So we contacted The Age in Melbourne, and they sent down a group of journalists who worked in The Age offices. And the first edition of the China Daily was actually produced in Melbourne from the Age press, and I have a copy of that very first edition. And it was very much a long-term vision that this was one of the consequences that was going to come from China opening up. So yes, I think government policy was there, and it was a long-term policy.
I think for the Chinese government is the same, because just on a visit of the Premier Li Keqiang several months or 1 month ago, they signed a long-term cooperation between two ministers of culture to encourage cultural exchange between two cultures, between two countries. So, and we have, as you know, we have staff from Ministry of Culture, both in the embassy and in the consulate and in Melbourne. So our vision is to encourage more groups of people to be involved in cultural exchange.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I feel very much inspired and fascinated by all the reflections and prospects of the exchange of culture between the two countries. I'm Qi Ruyin. I'm from Western Sydney University. I'm teaching Chinese language and bilingualism. All of you have mentioned bilingual, the importance of bilingual and the bicultural. My question is, how do we cultivate the young children learning Chinese and become not only competent linguistically, but also culturally, and become multinational, multilingual, global citizen? And also I would like to invite all of you, and the next one is, we will have a festival, and I would like to seek advice from Steve. And we will happen on the 8th of September at our Western Sydney University Bankstown campus. It's called Happy Chinese Day. We invite 100 to 200 school students come to shine and showcase the Chinese with our university students and teachers. And we'd like to invite all of you here and the panel people to be involved in our showcase, performing Chinese and culture event. But first, I would like to seek answer advice from you about how to cultivate kids.
I think experts are in the audience.
Yeah.
Take a line.
Yeah. All right. I don't think any of us can really answer that one, to be honest.
So I think your question is how to encourage the children to learn Chinese.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't think you should have a policy to encourage some people to learn Chinese, to learn the other country's language. And then if this is a kind of passion, a kind of necessity, if he needs to learn Chinese, he wants to communicate with Chinese people, and then he wants to learn Chinese. So when we have some workshops with the public schools, and just like that girl, she said that, Chinese culture is very interesting, and I'm attracted by Chinese culture. Then I want to choose Chinese as my selective class. So this is, I think, that this is a way to encourage them to learn the other country's language.
Okay, thanks. I think we're running out of time, so we should we appreciated all the questions and the members, and I should acknowledge few people in the audience: the Honourable Dr. Helen Shemho, the former member of the New South Wales Legislative Council, and Mr. Neelam, Deputy Director of DFAT New South Wales Office, and of course Councillor Kwok, Sydney Council. So look, I'd like to thank the panel and members of the audience tonight for sharing your experiences and the views, and the discussion's been very useful. It gives me very confident that we can build on the great work has already been done and develop innovative exchanges in the future that will be strongly supported by people in Australia and China. My particular thanks to the staff of the China Cultural Center for hosting this event, and of course Madam Li support, and for providing refreshments. Actually, we are now being served in the foyer, so please join us to go to the foyer for the refreshment, and thank you.